Yeah, I think Danika's gone. Well, I will start us off and introduce myself then. Hi, it's really awesome to meet all of you. I feel like I recognize a few of you from just around the writing sphere. So if we've run into each other before, it's very nice to see you again. Are you back, Danika?
My internet just went, yeah, whatever. Yes, thank you, Lewis. Lewis is a professional. He's good at this. Lewis and I met because we both run writing communities, and his is called The Forge, and his website is the Novel Smithy. Did you drop in? I've missed it. Did you drop a link to sign up for your newsletter, Lewis?
Yeah, I can drop that right now. So
Highly
yeah,
recommend.
hi. I'm for those who have not run into me before, I'm Lewis Jorstad. I run a site called The Novel Smithy. I'm a best-selling author of writing craft guides and a developmental editor that helps I like to say scrappy genre fiction authors master their craft and find their readers. I dropped a link in the chat for if you have any interest in grabbing some of my stuff and hanging out on my email list for a free set of questions to ask your protagonist if that's something that interests you. But today, I'm pretty sure our focus is going to be on a kind of behind the scenes of what developmental editing is all about, because that is my profession of choice and why it's not necessarily the golden ticket that I think a lot of writers think it is. So
Yeah. So, pardon me. Yes. Thank you. Well, look at you just jumping in. Uh,
sorry, I've been on calls all morning, so I'm in like call brain and I'm just kind of going for it. I
no, and
apologize.
it's fabulous. You can see my panic. Oh my gosh, I got kicked out of the room. Okay, one thing that I do want to mention, Lewis and I have become friends over the last year. He also runs a community where he provides a lot of craft support to writers of all genres. And I was a guest in his community. We've been guests on things together, and we hang out once a month supporting each other. I learned, though, today when he shared his bio with me, that when he's not helping coaching folks or playing on a Game Boy, like seriously, an old Game Boy, he says that he makes far too many bagels. And I have two problems, or I have a problem with that, which is I don't think it's possible to ever make too many bagels. And I have to ask, are your bagels boiled? Because if they're not, I think we have to challenge our friendship here. Do you boil your bagels?
I boil my bagels, yes.
Okay, good.
Otherwise, I'd just be making biscuits with holes in them. Like, come on.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone from Montreal or New York or Lewis, where are you from?
I'm from Virginia, but I learned from someone from New York how to make
Excellent.
bagels.
And I will go on record here and say I have a good friend who's in New York, and she sent me New York bagels, thinking they were as good as Montreal bagels. No, there you go. All right, let's talk developmental editing, debunking the developmental edit. Now, as authors, we often hear and are told we have to go through several rounds of editing if we want to be considered. I don't know if it's legitimate or taken seriously or to put our best work out in the world. So that includes we have to have a developmental edit, we have to have a copy edit, we have to have a line edit, we have to have a proofreader, better have an authenticity reader in there too if we're writing any characters who we don't have lived experience of. So that's a lot of editing. Far too much money for an indie author typically to afford, especially when we're first getting started. So I want to start, since you are a developmental editor and you have offered to debunk this idea. Debunk developmental editing for me, please, Lewis.
I would be happy to.
Thank you.
So to give some context, just for anyone to define our terms, because I've heard it used many different ways. Developmental editing, which is specifically my focus, is editing for story. So copy editing or line editing is really about prose, like how well does the sentence structure flow? Like, is it clear? Are you consistent in how you capitalize and punctuate things? That's very much a stylistic edit, which I think serves a very different purpose than, say, dev editing, which is what I do, that is more about looking at the story on that macro level. Are your characters strong on the page? Do you have clear characterization? You know, how's the pacing of the story? Do you have a clear central conflict? Like, will this connect with readers? There's often a little bit of like genre research involved in dev editing. Like, are you understanding some of the tropes of your genre? You know, how does that fit with the story that you're writing? Dev editing is typically the first type of professional editing that you would seek out as a writer. Once you have the story solid, then you can start thinking about copy editing, line editing, proofreading down the line. So my perspective on say line editing and proofreading is slightly different. I do think those have more of a place for a lot of writers, because depending on where your strengths lie as a writer, those might be really worthwhile. But dev editing is kind of complicated because it is so story-based. And so part of how the idea for this talk came up is that Danika and I were chatting one day, and I think I made an offhand comment about how I'm sick of getting manuscripts from writers that are on their fifth or sixth draft when they needed help on their first draft. And by now, the problems in the story are so entrenched that it would be so hard for them to fix them. But as a dev editor, what can I really do? They're handing me a draft that's basically finished, but has fundamental issues in the story. And so sort of the debunking the, you know, quote unquote myth of developmental editing is that every writer needs developmental editing, which I don't necessarily think is true. And that developmental editing, that kind of story editing, needs to come at the end of your writing process. So you've done everything you can in the draft, and now you're handing it off to an editor to show you what you missed. The fatal flaw of that is that sort of what I found over, you know, half a decade of doing that kind of editing is that most of the manuscripts that I receive have really fatal flaws. Like, they have, you know, deep-seated issues in terms of like the conflict is not clear, and that's step one. You know, there is no clear protagonist. You'd be surprised how many novels I get that have that as a problem. Point of view is all over the place, and that is also like step two of sort of developing a story. And that's not to say that those stories don't have tremendous potential, or that the writers who wrote them, you know, the prose is often beautiful, and so it's clear that they put a tremendous amount of work into their prose. You know, the ideas are really interesting, but a lot of those writers needed support earlier in the writing process to get sort of the core of their story working before they started to build out and start to polish their prose and perfect all the details. And what I find is that I, you know, will go through the manuscript and sort of write up my evaluation, and we'll meet and we'll talk about it. And the feedback I'll get from the writers is, this is too much for me to do. Like, I have already spent so much time on the story in this form. I'm not looking to upend the foundation of the story. I just want little tweaks to make it work. And I'm like, there are no little tweaks that will make this work. Like, the pacing is really skewed, or you don't have a clear sort of central cast. And that's hard feedback to get, understandably.
It must be hard feedback to give too.
It's hard to give, and it's hard to get, you know, especially when I can see so much about the story that's really excellent. Like, I'll look at these manuscripts and be like, the concept is so cool, and there's so much that you could do with this. I just wish that they had reached out and gotten support like halfway through their first draft, when I can tell they got stuck at a particular scene and circled on it for ages, because I can see how that scene was twisting the story into knots. And I wish I had been able to jump in in draft one and help them iron that out, so they could have moved forward with a bit more clarity.
I'm kind of wondering, like, the way you're talking, I approached Cathy Yardley. She's a book coach, a story coach, when I was struggling with a plot. And in an hour of conversation, she was able to untangle me and set me back on my path. And when you're talking, I'm thinking, like, framed as a story coach, like what you're talking about sounds to me like being a story coach. So how many developmental editors are story coaches, do you think? Or is that your role? Or are you just kind of bastardizing developmental editing for you. You know what I mean?
So I hear what you mean. My answer to that is sort of twofold. So I'm specifically mostly talking in the indie author space. That's mostly where I do most of my work, is with indie authors. And I think a lot of the freelance sort of developmental editing, when you approach a dev editor to work with you versus when you are maybe picked up by a publishing house and they have their in-house editor work on your manuscript, the freelance developmental editing world, I think, is a bastardization of the traditional publishing model. Because, you say in the olden days, you get your manuscript accepted by a publisher, it gets handed over to an editor, and then you work with that editor back and forth to sort of iron it out and polish it up and get it to a point where the publisher wants to release it. And what I think happened as a lot of authors transitioned to indie publishing and started needing support, not from a publisher, but from someone that they hired individually. And as traditional publishing started to expect different things of the manuscripts they were receiving, they started to want more of a finished product from the get-go versus a manuscript that needed work. I think a lot of dev editing is based on what people thought the traditional publishing editing model was, where it happens very late in the process and it is a very one and done thing. You hand me a manuscript, I go through it, I write up my report, we meet, we discuss, and then we're done. And I think it's important to put an asterisk on that, of like, that serves some writers. I know some brilliant developmental editors who follow that model. And for some of their editing clients, that's exactly what they need and nothing more. And that's fine. But I think for a large portion of writers, what they need is kind of like what you said, Danika, story coaching or book coaching is often what I hear it referred to as. And I actually know a lot of people who started as developmental editors who have transitioned into book coaching as they've started to run into some of the same problems that I've expressed here. And book coaching basically takes what I think was actually the old traditional editing model, where you take someone's interesting idea with a lot of potential and you work on it with them over a long stretch of time, a little bit at a time. And so you might work with a book coach for 12 months or 24 months or whatever amount of time you need to get that story really ironed out. But it happens a lot earlier in the process. So you might reach out to a book coach, often like you're looking ahead at your second draft and realizing you're really stuck on it, or plenty of people reach out to a book coach when they're starting their first draft, but you're not handing over like, here's my fifth draft of this novel that I consider basically finished, just get it over the finish line. You're saying, here's my really good idea that I really love and I'm excited about. Help me make it work as a novel, as a piece of commercial fiction.
Right. Thank you. Okay. There is a question. I know this is how long is a piece of string kind of question, but how much does a developmental editor cost, Lewis?
There's a huge range. Generally, I would say actually, let me do the math so I know I'm giving you a good number.
It's interesting, so while you're doing the math, to think about handing over a scrappy rough draft, because it'll have fewer words than a finished product typically. But then you're not done, right? Like an author who hands over a scrappy rough draft to you, or a fiction writer who hands over a draft to you, will get feedback, but then very likely, I imagine, they will also continue to need support with that story.
So to real quick answer the numbers question, for a traditional developmental edit, you're looking at usually around 300 words for every 10, or $300 for every 10,000 words. So on a 100,000 word draft, you're looking at $3,000 for one round of dev editing, which is a huge barrier for a lot of people. Obviously, there's a range on either side of that. I've seen dev edits that are $10,000. I've seen dev edits that are $1,000. It depends on the length. It depends on the genre. But generally about $300 for 10,000 words is usually a safe assumption.
Right.
To your point, though, for book coaching, if you handed someone your sort of scrappy rough draft, book coaching is usually, it's not word-based. It's usually built on being an ongoing relationship. So I just to think about one book coach that I know, because I can sort of speak to their prices a little more accurately, they do it as a monthly sort of relationship, almost like an editor on retainer, but they have like a specific almost curriculum that they're kind of guiding you through over about 6 months. And I think they charge just over $1,000 every month to do that. So again, it's expensive because you're working one-on-one with a person, and that's a lot of their time. Not, I say this as an editor, obviously, but it is a lot of work and it requires a very specific type of expertise. And so it is expensive. But what I imagine you're maybe getting at a little bit, Danika, is actually what you and I have shifted into doing, or I have shifted. I'm not quite sure if you've shifted into it or if you've always done it, but I have actually started to shift personally away from that old developmental editing model of handing, you hand me your manuscript and I take it and I do my evaluation and hand it back to you, to a more community model. So Danika, I know you have the
Author Ever After.
I run a community called The Forge, and that sort of idea of editing is that it's almost more like being, I like to think of it as a studio. So I have a background as a studio sculptor. And so almost like being in the studio, I paid for space in the studio. I paid for kiln time. I paid for materials. But as part of that, I'm in this environment with a bunch of other artists who are also all working towards, whatever projects they're working on, and a handful of teachers who are just there, who I can, as I'm working and get stuck, I can sort of flag one down and say, hey, my teacher's name was Karen. And hey Karen, like I'm really stuck on this piece. Like, can you just talk me through, like, what am I doing wrong? And she could sort of get in and get her hands in and be like, this is where you're getting stuck. Like, try this or try that. And so I think there's starting to become, the indie writing world is a relatively young industry. And I think that's important to recognize. Is like, we started out sort of trying to mimic traditional publishing. We realized that wasn't quite working, and we're sort of shifting into a new space. And one of those spaces is that more the studio, where just to speak to my community, The Forge as an example, I run, office hours. I'm available via DM. People can sort of post in the community when they're stuck on something or they're struggling. And I can jump in right then and there and say, like, have you thought about it this way? Or have you tried this? Or maybe you need to consider this. And that can catch those, those sticky scenes or those really fundamental problems at the first draft stage, so that by the time they get to their fourth draft, the story is in a really good place. And if they choose to work with an editor, which is where the debunking part is, at that point, I usually don't recommend most of my students hire a dev editor. If they really feel strongly that they want that validation, there's nothing wrong with that. But after spending, 8, 9, 12 months with me, just sort of like every time they get stuck, coming over and like picking at their story a little bit and giving them some guidance, most of my students don't need dev editing. The story is in a really good place. And it's a much more accessible setup than maybe having to save up, because a lot of writers end up with multiple rounds of dev editing, and that can become immensely expensive incredibly quickly.
Well, and also even in more so, or as important as the financial burden, there's the emotional burden that gets taken away. Like, you don't face that document that's so filled with red lines that you have to basically start over. I have been in that position. I was part of a program that was offered through SFU, Simon Fraser University, and it was by application. You submit pages. It was called the Manuscript Intensive, and they accepted me. I went through 6 months of edits, developmental edits, one-on-one with a coach, and at the end of it, I still didn't have a project that was publishable. It just absolutely was not publishable. And it was the most disheartening. And it was just like, it took away all my energy for writing. And so I really empathize with people who get back that, I handed in 110,000 words document, right?
Mhm.
Manuscript, and it was far too late. I needed that support much earlier. So I really love that. I love that as a developmental editor, you've got this different approach.
Mhm.
Natasha, do you want to ask your question live, like yourself? Use your own face?
Use my own face and my own mouth. Um, um, so anyway, I once hired someone for a developmental edit, and she was lovely, but I didn't get back what I wanted. I had sent in, it wasn't really that long, it was about 80,000 words or something. And I mean, I write fairly clean, even in rough draft, but I knew I needed some help shaping the story and so on. And she just basically gave me kind of a stylistic line edit. And as I said in my comment, that it took me putting the manuscript aside for 6 months before I realized it was 3 different books as part of a series. And that would have been awfully helpful to, and I don't think that's, I do believe that developmental editing is very difficult. I think it's the most difficult, but most interesting form of editing. But one would think that a developmental editor could see that there were too many stories in this one, and it was obviously 70 or 80,000 words in for 3 entire books in, is obviously everything's very compressed. So it needed expanding and teasing out and all that sort of stuff. And I got none of that.
So the question is, how do you identify who
Thank you.
a good a good fit developmental editor would be for you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I hear you on that. I have, I think in any industry, you're going to have, people who are incredibly good at their job. I know some dev editors where I would trust them with any story. I don't do one-on-one dev editing anymore, but when people reach out to me and we talk about it and we figure out that that is actually what they need, because there are definitely writers where that is actually what they need. I have a short list of editors that I send them to because I trust those editors implicitly. But I have also absolutely run into editors where I see their work and I've often received the aftermath of their work. And I raise an eyebrow at some of the work they do. And I don't say that to shame anybody. I appreciate that you said like dev editing is hard work, but I think it's also important to recognize that this is not in any way regulated industry. And so, Natasha, you could build a website and call yourself a developmental editor and market yourself as one. And there are potentially people who would believe you on that. Not that you couldn't do a great job or that you're not knowledgeable about story, but I think there's often a misconception that being a good writer translates to being a good editor. And those are 2 very different skill sets. And I think a lot of dev editors start out being like, well, I'm a good writer, so I will be a good editor. And I've even heard advice which blew my mind. I was so frustrated when I heard it. I heard advice from someone saying, if you're looking for a side job to help support your writing, to make more time for writing, become an editor. And I'm like, that's a terrible idea on multiple fronts. One, because editing is a full-time job. It is, I ironically started out this job because I wanted to make more time for my own writing. And I have less time for my writing now as a full-time editor than I did when I was working in retail many, many years ago. So that's a problem right there, but also it's a very specific skill set. So to your question, Natasha, how to figure out, like, if you are really certain that developmental editing is what you need, I would always ask to meet with the person one-on-one for just sort of like a discovery call. People use different terms for it. Some people call it orientation. Some people call it a discovery call. But even just being able to sit down with the person for 15, 30 minutes and say, like, this is the story I'm writing. This is where I think I'm stuck. And what are your thoughts on that, just sort of on the outset? Because that gives you a feel for them as a person, because a lot of it's also personality. Like, are you going to connect with them personality wise? But you can also start to get a feel for like, how well do they really know what they're talking about? And if you are pretty serious about it, you can also ask for a test edit. Test edits are, or like sample edits, are fraught in the developmental world, because how can you really talk about the macro level of a story when you're only seeing like 10 pages? So I wouldn't consider that a make or break thing, but if an editor offers it, I would always take them up on it, if that makes sense.
I did all those things.
Oh no. Oh no.
Yeah, I mean, she was a lovely person, but again, it was I was a reporter and now I'm a novelist and I'm a good writer. So she never claimed to be a trained developmental editor. And I didn't know that going in. And she didn't really charge very much, but I kind of feel it was a waste of her time and my time and money in the whole scheme of things. So, yeah.
So one thing to also consider is that there is no formal training for developmental editors. There are some programs that have started to be out there. I believe StoryGrid will certify people. Author Accelerator is another company that certifies people. Not in any way to knock those programs. But if I was a writer looking to hire a dev editor, I would not put much of any stock into those programs, because just like anything else, some of the editors coming out of those programs are brilliant and tremendously good at their job. And some of them are also not very good. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily a marker of quality. For instance, I have no professional training. I got into this from studying story and from doing editing on just a peer basis. And then slowly over time, I ended up doing this professionally, and sort of, hopefully, I would hope most of my clients think I'm very good at my job. I try very hard to be. And so, yeah, kind of to your point, Ashley, a lot of it is very subjective, and it is hard to find someone, which is also why a lot of writers, when they find an editor they like, hold on to them with a vice grip. They'll book out for novels they haven't even started writing yet, because they don't want to risk that they can't get in with the person that they trust.
And that's also a great sign that you're the editor that you're working with. If like Jen Sommersby from Plumfield Editing who has edited a couple of my books. And once I found her, I was like, I will never work with another editor. And I have to get onto her calendar a year in advance. So yeah, that's another indicator that works. I don't understand your question, Valerie. So maybe what are Plaqua? And the other, I had a question. Okay, now it's gone. Anyone
to
else?
jump in real quick on the subjective side, because I love that you brought that up. One thing I would also look for is word of mouth. And obviously that's complicated because, for instance, an editor, I collaborated with an editor who was very early in their career, and they didn't have a lot of word of mouth because they were just getting started, and they were great at their job. And I was super impressed by their mind for story. So some of it is just like, what is your risk tolerance? Are you willing to take a chance on someone who's a little bit cheaper, a little bit easier to get on their calendar, and maybe newer at this kind of work because you think that they would be really good, but you can't be sure? Or are you going to save up what is going to be more expensive and wait potentially a year to get on their calendar for someone who, 5 other writers who rave about how good they are? Some of it is also just risk tolerance.
Or alternately, like you led by saying two things. Well, by saying, like maybe not finish your draft, maybe not go through your 5 rounds of your own editing before you submit to a developmental editor. That would be another thing to consider too. Or hire a story coach. Or
work with a book coach, or join a community like what Danika runs or what I run, where you get that longer term relationship, but it's not the same level of investment as, say, a one-on-one book coach.
Well, and how do you feel about, you mentioned you alluded to this at the beginning, I think somehow. I know your particular expertise, you read a lot of fantasy, and fantasy is a place where you are solid with story. I would not, for myself, I'm actually pretty good with memoir and romance, but nothing else would I have any confidence to say I know what the beats we're looking for or what would be. How important is it, do you think, for a developmental editor to actually specialize at least to a bit? Like, I've seen editors who say, give me all your nonfiction, your business books, your fiction, and I think, no way, like, it's impossible that anybody knows the beats for all of those things, or knows, as you mentioned earlier, like what tropes have to be covered. What are your thoughts on that?
To the point about nonfiction, I do usually consider that a bit of a red flag. If someone is like, I do developmental editing for nonfiction and for fiction, I'm like, you don't really developmentally edit nonfiction. You do like content editing, which is a whole different world that I did professionally back in college to try to pay the bills. Like, that's a very different job than story editing for a novel. And so I usually give that a bit of side eye. Although, again, I have one person top of mind where I'm like, yeah, but she does both things and she's very good at her job. So there's exceptions to every rule. But I would usually consider that a red flag. In terms of specializing by genre, that's, again, it's kind of a fraught question in that I know some editors who do specialize specifically by genre. I know a brilliant thriller editor. It's the only thing she does is thriller, mystery, and horror. I know some very talented fantasy editors, and that's the only thing they do. But I also know some editors who do any kind of genre fiction and who are excellent at their job. I personally don't. I, as a reader, love fantasy, and that as a writer, I primarily work in the fantasy genre. But I have clients who are writing romance and thriller. I have a cozy mystery that I'm working with right now. I have a space opera that I'm working with right now. One of my clients is writing an urban fantasy at the moment, a romantic urban fantasy. There are, not to get really deep into craft, but as a craft guy, this is sort of where my brain is at. There are fundamental concepts that apply across genre. I know I mentioned, like, what's your core conflict? Like, what is the central conflict that bookends your story, that defines the beginning and end of the story? That is true, regardless of what genre you're writing. Who is your protagonist or protagonists, and how do they move through the story? How do they connect with readers on an emotional level? That's going to be true across genre. A lot of pacing is going to be true across genre. Like, how do you pace out the key beats of the story? In a romance, maybe those are spread out a little bit more. In a thriller, maybe they're a little bit tighter. But that's not necessarily genre as much as it's a stylistic choice for you as the author of how fast paced you want the story to be. But those key beats are still going to be there. So I think there's a lot of wisdom for finding an editor who specializes in the specific genre you're writing in, but I don't think it's going to make or break whether you have a good experience with them, because, like with all things, I have encountered some editors who did specialize very narrowly. I knew of a editor who only did cozy mysteries, and I would not recommend her work. So, again, lovely human being, I wouldn't recommend her work. So I don't necessarily think genre is the only thing to think about when looking for someone.
Good. No, excellent. Good. There are a ton of questions. I'm just going to run through these and you can read them too.
Please do.
What do you think that people could do without a developmental editor? And what are your tips for authors who are helping themselves? Which kind of might go along with this question. What's the difference between a developmental editor and an alpha reader? I'm just thinking maybe, not exactly the same, but I'm just thinking there's a link there potentially.
I'll answer the alpha reader one first, because that one's pretty easy. A alpha reader or a beta reader are not professionals. There are people who market themselves as professional beta readers. I have a slightly weird relationship with that. I think that's slightly strange. Generally, alpha readers or beta readers are your peers or readers of your genre. An editor is a professional who has a deeper level of understanding of storytelling, who should be able to speak on a much higher level to like the very specific aspects of your story that you can strengthen or adjust. Whereas an alpha reader is more of a gut check. An alpha reader is going to read your second draft, or maybe even your first draft, although generally I don't recommend that just for like your mental health, because first drafts are very vulnerable things. But a second draft or a third draft, an alpha reader is going to go through and just say like, yeah, I think you're doing what you think you're doing. You know, I actually have a writer right now that I'm working with in my community who's starting to look for alpha readers. And I recommended that to him because he was starting to say, well, I've just been working on editing this one scene over and over again for weeks, and I'm just not sure it's doing what I want it to anymore. I've stared at it for so long. And to me, that was a sign that he just needed an outside set of eyes. And obviously, I was there to sort of talk through story with him, but he just wanted someone to read the whole thing and be like, is this what I think it is?
Mhm.
And so I recommended that he reach out and start finding some alpha readers. Often you'll reach out, an alpha reader will be a friend in the writing community or a fellow writer who, you know, they're widely read. They've probably written, you know, some novels of their own. They have some experience that they can speak to. But what you're really looking for is just a gut check on, is this working the way I think it is? Beta readers are kind of a similar deal, whereas an editor is going to go in and say, you know, on a macro level, like your pacing is really skewed to your third act. Like an alpha reader probably will not give you that feedback. They'll say the pacing just felt weird, but I don't really know why. You know, they might have ideas of why, but an editor can say with a lot more confidence, like, you know, oh, your climax is happening too late in the story. You're not having enough of a down ramp in your resolution. Like most other writers wouldn't be able to give you that feedback.
Yeah.
So the question about what can you do if you're not going to work with an editor, that is where I think, again, kind of coming back to that community idea, find, you know, so again, sort of to tie back into like how do you know if someone's going to be worth your time, or if it's going to be the kind of edit or feedback that you're looking for. Try to expose yourself to a lot of different people. Obviously, there's all kinds of like summits and free events. Like people have articles on their website often that you can read through. A lot of editors also publish books on the writing craft. A lot of editors will do free classes or will do paid classes, but that are relatively affordable. You know, for a group workshop, I'll often charge like $47, $50, which is not a terrible amount to drop versus dropping $3,000 on an edit. Or join communities like the ones that Danika I run, where you just get exposure to some of these people and you can start to get a feel for, again, like, do you mesh with their personality? But is one, do they know what they're talking about? But two, does the way they explain things click with your brain? You know, I like to think that I'm very good at storytelling, not to just toot my own horn. I like to think I know what I'm talking about, though. But that doesn't mean every writer I've worked with has clicked with the way I explain things. And that's okay. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them or anything wrong with me. Just they're looking for a slightly different person. And often the best way to find that out is to just be exposed to people and figure out what voices click with your brain and your writing process in the community. And then gravitate towards those people and then start to see like, well, do they do developmental editing? Do they run a community or have a program I could go through that could give me that kind of deeper feedback? And that might not be editing in the like traditional sense. But you could still make tremendous progress in terms of your craft as a writer through, you know, a course that someone teaches that has a feedback component, or through a community that someone runs that has a feedback component. Usually feedback is the big part of it, though, is like teaching you the concepts that you need, but also then helping you see how those apply to your story specifically, because that's not always clear.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Lori Schnebley, what is her name? Lori Schnebley
Campbell.
Lori Schnebley Campbell is someone who is excellent. If you can get into one of her workshops. She provides feedback in all of her workshops at that kind of early story stage for some of her courses. She's excellent. So you mentioned a community a lot. Can you think of, or do you know of, places where writers can go to find people who might be a good fit for that early stage connecting and story editing? Is there a specific?
I don't think there's necessarily a specific place. Again, just be in the writing community. I know I mentioned like attending summits. A lot of them are free to attend live. Like, attend summits, go to talks that sound interesting to you, and do you connect with that person? Look, or like, a lot of it is starting out by trying to educate yourself, and in the process, you will often find people in the community who are, editors or who are coaches in some way, who you do connect with, and then you can further explore maybe working with them. But taking the time to sort of start out by trying to learn what you can on, yeah, exactly. Tammy said that's how you found Danika. Trying to study, like, okay, maybe you're struggling with your characters. Maybe you don't know what's wrong, but something's wrong and you're trying to figure out what. Type into Google, like, how do you write better characters? See what comes up. See what summits pop up in your inbox that have lessons on character development happening, or see, check out, are there any people on YouTube talking about these things? And at first, that process is often a little overwhelming because there's a lot of voices in this industry, but start to get a feel for, what is out there. And then over time, you can start to narrow down and say, like, okay, well, there are like 20 people out there I could be listening to, but 10 of them I just don't vibe with on the outset. I don't really like the way they teach. That's okay. Narrow down, like, of those 10, who do you really connect with? Who do you keep coming back to? And sort of start wide and then start to narrow down of like, okay, I have like 2 or 3 people that I listen to in this space that really connect with me, that have really helped me make progress. And those are often the people you would look to for that further, like, one-on-one support versus just sort of attending like a group class or whatever you might be finding them through.
Yeah, that is all excellent advice. And it also occurred to me when you were talking, podcasts are a great place to start listening, listening for the guests on certain writer podcasts. We should have a list of those great podcasts. Other questions? Thank you. We could just, gather a list of all the places that you've spoken, Lewis, as a starting place, and go from there. Sasha Black, does she do developmental editing?
I don't believe she does anymore. I believe she mostly does group programs. She runs a community of sorts, but I'm not exactly sure the setup for it.
Right. She's the Rebel, what is it?
Rebel Author podcast.
Author.
Yeah. And she's excellent. One, Sasha is brilliant and lovely in her own right, but she's also a very good host. And so she has a lot of interesting guests that you might find people through where you're like, oh, wow, that guest like really like connected with me. Like, I want to go look further into their work. That can also be an avenue for sure.
Thank you. Other questions, folks? No. Okay, people who have been quiet.
I'd love if everyone's comfortable. Just like if everyone would give like a show of hands, have you worked one-on-one with an editor or a book coach in the past? Or have you not?
So we've got 1, 2, so 4 yeses, 1 no, another not yet.
A little bit.
A little bit.
Okay.
Nope. All right. We're about, and I haven't, so we're like 50-50. The folks on camera have, and the folks not on camera have not. That's kind of the way this worked out. Oh, Sarah has. She's not on camera, but she has, I know for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, a little better than half. And what do you want? You have morning hair, Bunny. What are you concluding from that, Lewis? Or what's your takeaway?
I was mostly just curious. I was going to say, for those of you who have worked one-on-one with an editor or a coach in the past, I'm curious if any of this resonated with you, or if you had a different experience, because again, dev editing can be the right fit for some authors. I just don't think it's the holy grail, or like this gate that you have to pass through. to succeed as an author. So I'm curious what y'all's experience has been. I know, Natasha, you had not so great an experience, and I apologize.
Valerie.
I started following an author who was doing a readers podcast with an editor friend of hers, and I really enjoyed the banter between the two of them. And that's how I found the story coach I'm working with right now, was from that podcast, which is no longer being produced. But I found it very helpful because I got over several months, got a real deep, I guess, understanding of what she was all about by knowing what she liked to read, what her experience had been in the past. And along with recommending books, they also shared a lot of their personal reading journey. So that really worked for me. And I think, yay, podcasts.
Yay. Yay. Ella got lucky on Fiverr. Well done.
Ooh, that's very lucky.
Yeah. James says, I think if you're grounded in proper, whoops, I just lost it, proper story structure, the developmental editor would be less necessary. Comments on that one?
I don't think that's necessarily true, because just speaking from experience, I've seen a lot of manuscripts that followed like a well-established story structure, like Save the Cat or the 3-act structure of the hero's journey to a T, and still were not working as novels. Still had really like fundamental issues. But I do think there is some wisdom to that of, I think some of it is also just, again, that gut check of like, if you're working on your manuscript and you are finding yourself getting stuck and you're like, I know I am missing something. I know something is not working here. And you're struggling to articulate what, having a professional whose job it is to help you figure that out can be incredibly worthwhile. And often I find that many writers need that kind of editing for their first 1 or 2 novels. But by the time they hit their 3rd or their 4th, they've sort of developed a sense for their specific stories, how those pieces need to fit together. And it's less necessary for future novels. Not to say that there aren't writers who, I'm thinking of one that I know of tangentially, who I think just published her like 20th novel, and she works with a developmental editor on every single one, because that's what she needs for her process. There's nothing wrong with that. But yeah, I would say that for structure, structure is a piece of it. And if you feel really comfortable with your structure, that's excellent. But if you are feeling like there's maybe other pieces missing, structure is not necessarily the be all end all. And it might mean you still want to seek out some form of feedback from somebody.
Yeah. And like you say, like there is no one size fits all. I think what some of my stories have had a developmental editor and some haven't. Some I've been confident with and some I have not. And Kirsten runs her manuscript through Fictionary, and the graph helps her visualize her story structure before she sends it to her editor, who does a hybrid thing for her, which is really interesting. There was something else though we were going to, I thought. Okay. Sarah, you were going to say something. You came on camera.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about my experience. So I actually found my editor, who I love, through a community. She started out as a beta reader, and then she went and did a whole editing program, started her editing business. And I was like, hey, I'm ready for a developmental editor. I already loved her style and the beta reading that she did. And so she did my first book, which was excellent. So I hired her to do the second because it's a trilogy. And in the second, I knew there was something not working. And one of my beta readers, who's not an author, but she's a really big reader, she's like, I think that you need to take out this particular character. I asked my editor and she's like, I don't think that's the character that needs to come out. I think it's this character. And I was like, no, you're wrong. 2 days later, I was like, absolutely 100% right. I took the character out and the book works. And so I think it was, part of that was we built that trust that she knows what the story is supposed to be, and so I trust her to help me with it. But I think that it's an interesting way that we got there. And like I said, it started out as she beta read the whole thing for me, gave me such amazing feedback that then I was like, I want to pay you to do this even more. So
thank you. Yeah,
I'm
and
so
again,
happy you found her too, because like that, yeah, having, Danika, I think you mentioned like how crushing it can be to get an evaluation back, and it's just all red pen, and you're just like, I can never get through this. And I usually find that writers have one of two reactions. Either they're like, clearly you're full of shit, and I'm not going to listen to anything you said because it's emotionally overwhelming, which I understand on an emotional level. Or they say, clearly my story sucks and I can never succeed, and they give up. I've had very few writers who got really rough feedback that just took it in stride. Like that's hard, understandably. But it's a lot easier when you have a relationship with the person and you trust them, and you know that I actually had this experience with some of the students in my community. We did a critique circle, and I was chatting with one of them, and I had some slightly heavy feedback. My feedback basically amounted to, this is a really good idea, but there isn't really a story here. Like, what is the central thread of this? And she took that pretty hard, understandably, because that's kind of heavy feedback. And I followed up with her the next day and said, hey, how are you feeling about that? I know that was kind of heavy feedback. And her comment was basically, that really stung in the moment, but I know that you respect me as a writer, and that you aren't just trying to make me feel bad. And so I thought more about it, and I do realize that you're right. And like, if we didn't have that existing relationship, she probably wouldn't have done that. She would have dismissed it or just felt hurt. And that wasn't the goal at all. So yeah, I think to your point, like finding someone that you not only respect in terms of them as a professional, like they know what they're talking about, but someone you can trust and like develop a good relationship with makes all the difference in the world, for sure.
And in fact, that is one of the key themes that's come up with every conversation I've had through the fall with different kinds of editors, is how this is a relationship-based relationship. I mean, when as writers, it's one of the things that makes me kind of put hybrid publishers, Vanity Press fall into the devil's zone, but hybrid publishers where you pay and you get services delivered to you, but you never get to meet your service providers. I think that is that's a no-go for me. And it's a no-go for me to recommend, because those editors you want to be developing relationships with, you need to be developing relationships with, I believe. And all the editors that I've talked to through the fall have said the same thing. It's like, you find the people that you jive with, because for them, it can be really hard for them working with authors who are not a good fit for them. It's not just all about us. So yeah, I just wanted to, I know, Tammy, it is sometimes it's about them.
It is very both ways. I have definitely worked with some writers where we just did not jive, and it wasn't fair to either of us. Like, I couldn't do my best work because they were not receptive to it, and they weren't getting what they needed out of it because they weren't receptive to me, and that's okay.
Yeah.
We just weren't a good fit. But I wish we had figured that out before I spent 3 weeks, editing their manuscript. Yeah, that was that one case I'm thinking of in particular was a bit of a fluke, for sure.
I actually have had the experience where I took a contract editing. It was a memoir, and it was with a gentleman who kind of hounded me to let him hire me, because I was thinking, I don't think I'm the right fit. I don't think I'm the right fit. And he said, I believe you are. And he convinced me I was. And I did half to 2/3 of his book. And I was suffering through it, and he wasn't accepting my feedback. And I finally took it, and I actually gave it to the editor that Sarah is working with now. I said, this is this book. I think you can handle it, and him, and the release. So we moved it over there, and I believe that was a good move, and it was definitely the right move, because he and I ultimately I wasn't giving him what he wanted, and I couldn't give him what he wanted. So
yeah, you'd be shocked the number of writers who will hire an editor for their feedback and will then dismiss or not listen to any of their feedback. And it's frustrating because you want to support them, you want to make sure they're getting what they need, but it has to be a two-way relationship. And I've never quite cracked the code on why that is, but I have experienced that on occasion as well.
James, you ask wanted or needed. Yeah, he needed particular feedback, but he wanted something else. So
yeah, exactly.
I guess I don't know how I presented myself, but possibly as a pushover, because I let him bully me into letting him hire me. Anyway, Lewis, any final questions from anybody? Any final words from you, Lewis?
Mostly just thanks to everybody for letting me monopolize your time for an hour. I hope this was at least somewhat valuable, some behind the scenes for y'all. And Natasha, jump in first.
I just have a quick question. Can you tell us a little bit more about your community? I'd like to know.
Oh, absolutely. So I'm actually not sure, Danika, is everyone here part of your community, or is this your broader audience?
More than half are my community and some are broader.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Because I was gonna say it's very similar to what Danika does, but if y'all don't all know, then I should give more context.
Definitely.
So I run a community called The Forge, where we have sort of a central curriculum, like a central course that writers can work through. But as part of that, we also have a community space, similar to a forum space, where people have access to me as an editor for support as they're going through that. And they can work entirely at their own pace, which I think has been a really positive change for a lot of people. They can post for support on, just gut checks on like, hey, I'm feeling stuck on this. Like, am I even going in the right direction? And other people in the community can jump in and give feedback. One of the dark horses of this whole thing is that a lot of people joined thinking that they were just interested in getting access to me. And then I follow up with them 6 months later and they're like, honestly, I don't care as much about you. I have all these co-writing groups I'm part of now that are great. And I'll call you when I get stuck, which is quite funny. And I'm always very thrilled for them. But we also have things like editor office hours. We bring in guest experts. So Danika has come and spoke with us about writing romance. And the idea of it is that rather than, again, working in isolation on your manuscript for however long, and then shelling out a bunch of money for an editor, not being sure it's going to be the right fit for you, and not being sure that that you haven't gotten entrenched problems in the story that are going to be really hard to fix. The idea of The Forge is that you can come in and at your own pace around whatever's going on in your life, make progress on your story and have access to someone or to a group of people that you can reach out to when you are getting stuck, or who can help course correct. If you show up to office hours and are like, I'm having a really hard time, but I don't know why, I can jump in and say like, have you thought about this? Or maybe you should shift this way. Yeah, exactly. So you can forge your own paths. I love that. So yeah, so it's a cool environment, and it's a shift away from part of what I was sort of trying to get at here, is that the old developmental editing model, I think, will change over the years, as I think more editors, at least in my circle, are moving to book coaching or to running communities, because it is a less isolated way of doing editing. And I think there's a lot of benefits to that, because again, you get that earlier support, but you also get the support of someone that you have a relationship with, that you trust long-term. You don't just, I'm not just going to show up one day in your inbox with a giant evaluation and say like, this all is a problem. And you're going to feel very emotionally defeated, which is understandable.
For me, the community piece is just, that is, I think, the biggest thing that we have in common. I think our communities are nice complements to each other. Because I'm not focused as much on craft, but there is also a question. Are you willing to answer price on community?
Yes.
As of November 2023, because this may change, right?
Yes, as of November 2023, we are currently on only a quarterly model, and I believe, actually, I will look it up so that I'm not good at remembering numbers if you can't tell. So I always try to like actually look it up so I'm giving you the correct information. We are, if it'll load.
Let's drop the link in. I'll go grab the link while you're looking it up, unless you've got it right there.
I don't, bless
Okay.
my internet. We are currently $179 a quarter. So we have had a couple of people reach out asking about doing a monthly option. We're considering it. So if you are at all interested in joining the Forge, we would love to have you. Yes, USD. But if you think that the quarterly is a little bit much for you right now, consider checking back in a couple months. If you join my, if you pick up the freebie that I dropped, and I can actually drop that link again if you'd like it. You can grab that. That's totally free. But if you end up on my email list, I always let people know if like pricing is changing or any events that we're doing in the Forge. So you're welcome to sit on it. But we might be doing monthly, although I know, Danika, you'll try to talk me out of it, but we might be doing a monthly option sometime in the spring if people need that. So
I don't know that I'd talk you out of it. I wouldn't recommend it, but and I've dropped in the Forge link to Lewis's community there for everyone, and I will put it in the notes below the video, the conversation. Thank you, Lewis. You're fabulous.
And I'm actually going to drop a different link.
Oh, okay.
To our actual sign up page so you can see what's inside versus just the login page. But
okay, good. Thank you.
Awesome.
All right. Okay. Thanks for your time this morning. Always lovely to hang out with you. Everyone who showed up live, thank you. And thank you for your questions and comments. Kirsten, lovely to see you. Congratulations on your recent releases. Yay.
Oh,
and
awesome.
Sarah, congratulations on your release last week. Second book in the series. Yay. Who else has got a release that they've just done? Anybody else here right now? Ella, have you released one recently? Yes. Congratulations on your recent release. Okay.
Man, y'all are doing great.
You know what? I'm going to
awesome.
put everybody email me, Kirsten, Ella, Sarah, with your new releases, and I will put them in the show notes below this video. All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I look forward to seeing you all in the weeks to come.
Thank you so much, everybody.